Hi, and welcome to Strategy Stuff. When it comes to conquest in the late 18th century, we usually think first of revolutionary France and its attempts to establish hegemony over Europe. But during the same period, Britain, or more accurately its East India Company, also conquered out a hegemony in South Asia, one that was just as extensive and certainly longer lasting than the French attempt. In a series of wars between 1799 and 1806, British Indian forces decisively defeated almost all their indigenous rivals on the subcontinent, most notably the Sultanate of Mysore in the south and the Maratha Empire in the center and north. In the process, British rule expanded throughout the coasts and up the Ganges River, seizing many old and famous states along the way. By the end of the period, there was no longer any doubt. Britain alone dominated this jewel in the crown. These events are usually interpreted as an inevitable consequence of European military superiority, but in fact, throughout this period, most British strategy makers opposed and even tried to stop expansion. That it happened anyway was arguably due to one man, the chief official of British India, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, and his desire to conquer the subcontinent for his own political gain. Ironically, India would give a bigger boost to the career of Richard's younger brother, Arthur Wellesley, later to achieve military fame as the Duke of Wellington. To minimize confusion, this video series will refer to Richard as Mornington and Arthur anachronistically as Wellington. Together, they, alongside other generals and officials, would not only produce a seminal example of European imperialism, but also forcibly induct South Asia into the European world order and lay the groundwork for the modern states that exist there today. This is part 1 of a 5-part series where we will go over the situation in India during the 1790s, as well as examine why Britain embarked on conquest. By the 1790s, European states had collectively been in India for nearly 3 centuries, but they still knew remarkably little about the subcontinent. Part of this was due to their tendency to characterize Indian society as being filled with Oriental traditions such as Hinduism, caste, and village communalism, all allegedly indecipherable from a Western perspective. In fact, when it came to political dynamics, Indian states operated under conditions loosely akin to medieval European feudalism. Above all, and unlike most of 18th century Europe, Indian rulers did not have large central bureaucracies to extract financial and military resources from their lands themselves. Instead, they relied on local lords to collect taxes and raise troops, which inevitably meant that the lords kept a portion of those resources for their own use. And just like in feudal Europe, this meant that the local lords could resist their rulers, leading to a chronic and cyclical struggle between them. When the state was young and unsettled, rulers could reorganize elite networks to dominate the lords and take their resources. But as the state matured and rigidified, rulers lost the ability to reorganize and dominate, which let the lords keep more resources and put up stronger resistance. This began a self-reinforcing cycle that would eventually reduce the ruler to a powerless figurehead, while the lords became independent states in all but name. Over the course of the 18th century, South Asia experienced 3 such cycles at the empire level. First, the Mughal emperor lost power to the Maratha emperor. Then, the Maratha emperor lost power to his prime minister, or Peshwa. And finally, the Maratha Peshwa lost power to his subordinates. Similar cycles also occurred at the local level, shattering India into a constellation of independent and practically independent states, the smallest ones no larger than a fort, while the largest ones sprawled over several regions. Formal borders didn't really exist. Instead, there were frontier zones where local populations switched support to whichever lord bribed or threatened them at that very moment. Warfare was endemic within such an environment. To defend themselves, local lords raised the typical feudal units of peasant levies and aristocratic cavalry, but the richest ones also hired from an extensive mercenary economy trading in professional soldiers, nomadic cavalry, and even entire supply trains. In fact, the use of mercenaries was so predominant that Indian wars were less about actual fighting and more about the constant negotiation to quote-unquote rehire enemy forces on agreeable terms. One might expect mercenary costs to greatly advantage the wealthy regions of India, particularly the coasts which hosted the legendary spice trade. But as with most things strategy, success is less about spending the most resources and more about spending them efficiently. And throughout this period, there was no more resource-efficient Indian military unit than light cavalry, which would both conduct and be paid from large-scale plundering raids. So by sending swarms of light cavalry into enemy territory, Indian rulers could exert significant military pressure at minimal cost. This practice was so common that the English word loot comes from it. As such, the strongest indigenous states of the period were those best able to deploy light cavalry, namely the ones situated on the drier, poorer, yet cavalry-friendlier plateaus of inland India. There was the Sultanate of Mysore in the south, the Nizamate of Hyderabad in the center, and the great lords of the Maratha Empire in the center and north. There were also the Afghans to the far northwest, whose periodic eruptions into the subcontinent were a source of constant anxiety to all, including the British. By the 1790s, this military picture was slowly changing, as indigenous rulers gradually adopted European military methods based around drilled musket infantry. Still, the geopolitical picture remained largely intact. After all, only the established powers could offer protection to the trading companies who sold the guns and the instructors. So the list of states that trained European-style sepoy infantry remained the same as before: Mysore, Hyderabad, the great Maratha lords, and they used these units to great effect against unreformed neighbors, further consolidating their joint dominance over India. In the process, however, the indigenous powers also had to confront the problems associated with so-called Westernization, as the costs of adopting European military methods clashed with the feudal basis of Indian government. In particular, unlike light cavalry, sepoys couldn't pay for themselves through raiding. The state had to pay them regularly, and that would require a larger and stabler resource stream than what the traditional reliance on local lords could provide. So in response, almost every indigenous ruler initiated centralization reforms to try and extract more revenue from their lands. Some repurposed their sepoys as armed tax collectors. Others adopted the much-maligned practice of tax farming, where taxation rights were sold to urban elites. Topping them all were the efforts of the Mysore sultans, who suppressed the feudal system and replaced it with a central tax bureaucracy built from scratch. Despite it all, these efforts yielded only partial success, and every indigenous ruler continued to struggle with paying sepoys. Furthermore, the feudal lords did not appreciate being sidelined by centralization, and their opposition opened up political divides that an enemy could exploit. Still, the mere existence of reforms worried European observers, with some warning that the British had only 30 years before the Indians caught up and ejected them from the subcontinent. This was a Eurocentric assessment. In reality, indigenous states, except maybe Mysore, reformed mainly to better fight each other, not Westerners. To them, the British were not only a source of technology and trade, but also a safe counterbalance against any indigenous rival seeking hegemony. After all, nothing indicated that the British wanted to carve out their own hegemony over India, at least not until now. The late 18th century was as much a period of reform for the British Empire as it was for India, so much so that historians have used it as a dividing line separating the First British Empire, focused on the Atlantic, and the Second British Empire, focused on Asia. British India itself reflects this change quite nicely. At the start of this period in 1798, its leaders were mostly veterans of the American Revolutionary War. By the end of it, in 1807, its rising stars would go on to enjoy careers in South and Southeast Asia. This generational change affected not just personnel, but also British thinking about empire. In the 1790s, most of the British imperial leadership, including both Parliament and the directors of the East India Company, or EIC, had what this video series will call a mercantilist view of British grand strategy. To them, the point of empire was to bring in as much gold as possible into British coffers. Mercantilists therefore assessed imperial strategy through the lens of short-term profit, a focus sharpened by the EIC's debt crisis throughout the previous decades. To them, British India was there to supply the EIC with goods needed for a profitable trade, not just spices and textiles, but also silver to buy Chinese tea. By this metric, British India was already a complete success. The EIC controlled the relevant crop areas in southern India, and in the east, its takeover of Bengal in the 1760s had given it a large population that could be taxed for silver. No European rival could challenge this position, nor stop the British from accessing the subcontinent. Mercantilists therefore argued that there was nothing more that Britain wanted or should want from India, and any further expansion would only lead to needless expenses and the acquisition of unnecessary territory. Mercantilism had long guided British strategy, but by the late 18th century, a new viewpoint was rising up to challenge it, which this video series will call Reformist. Influenced by the political theories of the Enlightenment, Reformists believed that the state, rather than being a mere tool for profit, should also be used to establish a quote-unquote rational order over society. This thinking is usually associated with the wholesale reorganization of revolutionary France, but, crucially for this video series, British reformists wanted to reorganize society too. They just wanted to achieve it through reform, not revolution, and by promoting the rule of the landed gentry, rather than a central bureaucracy. Reformists therefore assessed British Indian policy from a different perspective. Firstly, they demanded internal reform of the EIC in order to make it less corrupt and more rational. This eventually resulted in a whole host of changes aimed at raising the quality of colonial governance, ranging from language requirements for officials to army medical units to systematic tax and geographic surveys. Secondly, reformist ambitions were not limited to British society. Many also believed that Indian society needed to be rationalized. Inevitably, rational was defined from the British perspective as a post-feudal European state, so little within Indian feudalism was ever seen as rational. Instead, Indian village life was quote-unquote lazy, Indian mercenary negotiation was deceitful, and Indian centralization initiatives were corrupt. As reformists saw it, these traditions prevented Indian society from rationally making good use of its resources, and so it was Britain's burden to develop the subcontinent. Lastly, reformists also sought to align government policy with a grand strategy based on a rational analysis of Britain's geographic position and comparative advantages. Most concluded that such a grand strategy involved being the conduit and guarantor for global trade, which in turn meant that British power was best used to both open up new markets for British trade and to stop indigenous powers from closing off existing ones. Accordingly, the indigenous states of India, with their vast untapped populations and worryingly strengthening governments, became priority targets whose control would secure Britain's place in the sun, especially after the loss of the 13 colonies. In short, the debate over British Indian strategy boiled down to two policy positions: either keep to the status quo and risk what reformists feared would be strategic and civilizational stagnation, or expand and risk what mercantilists feared would be a financial drain. But that said, practical politics muddied these distinctions significantly. Britain's Prime Minister during the 1780s and 90s was Pitt the Younger, and he supported the reformist position on India and the EIC. However, in order to get the mercantilists to support company reform, Pitt had to give them an India Act that was strategically mercantilist, even going so far as to ban British aggression against the indigenous powers. But cunningly, Pitt left an opening that he hoped to eventually use for Indian expansion. the act gave the Prime Minister great influence over who was to be the Governor-General of Bengal, who actually oversaw all EIC holdings in India. And while the Governor-General was, on paper, primarily responsible to the mercantilist directors of the EIC, a politically strong Prime Minister could shield his appointee from the latter's fury, and in so doing, get British India to pursue state rather than company interests. In 1796, Pitt felt that he was politically strong enough to give British India to his preferred candidate, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington. This was partly rewarding a political supporter, but equally importantly, Pitt knew that Mornington desired great achievements to advance his political career. And just to be absolutely sure, Pitt and his colleagues privately encouraged Mornington to expand British India, even as his official instructions continued to parrot the mercantilist strategy of non-aggression. And so in late 1797, Mornington departed for British India to become its Governor-General, determined to make his mark on the subcontinent. Mornington arrived in India on April 1798, finding a land where the British were a major, but by no means hegemonic, player. The formal holdings of the EIC were split into 3 presidencies, each isolated on land from the others. In the east was Bengal on the lower Ganges River, whose capital, Calcutta, was also the capital of British India. In the south was Madras, whose coastal enclaves hosted the company's spice trade, and in the west was Bombay, the oldest possession, but for now, just an unprofitable group of islands that the EIC had nearly considered abandoning. Attached to each presidency were the informal holdings of the EIC, consisting of indigenous states bound to the British through so-called subsidiary alliances. These were essentially vassal treaties where the ruler had to accept EIC direction over his foreign affairs, and also pay for an EIC garrison within his own capital. Subsidiary alliances were a clever way for the EIC to offload some of its military expenses while gaining buffer zones further up the Ganges and along the coasts to shield its formal holdings from hostile invasion. Beyond that, the British also had a regular alliance with Hyderabad in central inland India, the latter having suffered a near-death experience against the Maratha lords in 1795. None of these links were particularly exotic from a European perspective, but one of the most important relationships the British had in India was, in fact, not with a major landed power. It was with the Mughal emperor in Delhi on the upper Ganges. Once, his empire encompassed almost all of the subcontinent. Now, he barely ruled even the city of Delhi itself. But that historical legacy meant that most of the subcontinent's rulers still saw him as a source of legitimacy whose endorsement would justify their own rule. The British were no exception. After all, they technically only governed Bengal on behalf of the Mughals. So far, the British had acted as a loyal, though nominal, subordinate of the emperor. But this meant that it was the emperor, not the British, who determined what was legitimate when it came to subcontinental governance. As a result, previous governor-generals had to put up with certain behaviors that would have been absolutely unacceptable within Europe, in particular, the tendency of allies, vassals, and even officials to share political, diplomatic, or military information with other states. This was the situation that greeted Mornington on his arrival, and with his need for achievement in mind, the new Governor-General soon decided on 2 policies that would align India with reformist goals. Firstly, British India would expand. It would take all the remaining coast, occupy whatever valuable territory was inland, and place as much of the subcontinent as possible under its influence. Secondly, Mornington would also begin the work of rationalizing, or more accurately, Europeanizing India. At the domestic level, this meant remaking Indian feudal society to better resemble the British experience. At the international level, British India would ditch its subordination to the Mughals and establish a new regional state order with European standards of behavior, and Britain, naturally, as its head. Such changes would of course render India more accessible to British exploitation, but reformists also believed that they would also be removing many of the barriers that hindered India's development. In a sense, such a project was not so different from revolutionary France's famous reorganization of Central Europe a decade later. Both expansion and reorganization put British India on a collision course with everybody else on the subcontinent. But even before that, Mornington first had to neutralize the inevitable opposition from the mercantilist directors of the EIC, who, albeit with a communications lag of 6 months, would doubtlessly try to impeach him for violating the India Act's ban on aggression. To a limited extent, Mornington tried to persuade the EIC, speculating that acquiring new territories and vassals would bring in additional profits. But for the most part, he preferred to appeal to state interest, and in so doing get Parliament to override the EIC. To achieve this, Mornington spun a new narrative for India, claiming that a hostile coalition was forming against the British, and the only way to survive was to embrace aggression and defeat each enemy preemptively. But who was to be the British boogeyman? Given that this was 1798, the answer was, of course, revolutionary France. In reality, Mornington did not believe that France, even in league with its Spanish and Dutch allies, posed any threat to British India. Nevertheless, playing up the French threat was a surefire way to get Parliament to endorse expansion, and what's more, the French played their part perfectly. In early 1798, the French governor of Mauritius made a rather ineffective call for volunteers to help the indigenous British rival of Mysore. More dramatically, in mid-1798, Napoleon set out to conquer Egypt, with India rumored to be his ultimate target. But if that was indeed the intention, a British naval squadron in the Red Sea quickly stopped any further progress. All these seemingly validated Mornington's conspiracy of a French threat to British India. According to this narrative, Paris was an omnipresent manipulator of Indian states, and all French mercenaries, royalist or revolutionary, were fifth columnists itching to raise the tricolore. Their machinations had already made Mysore into a French puppet, and every indigenous power with French officers or French-trained sepoys, i.e. all of them, was only one coup away from suffering the same fate. The French could supposedly even get Persia to get the Afghans to invade India. Mornington's ploy worked. His master, Prime Minister Pitt, remained politically strong and easily suppressed mercantilist calls for a less hysterical assessment. And so, Parliament retroactively agreed that the removal of French influence in India, no matter how vague, was a valid reason to take offensive action, no matter how drastic. Mornington now had a free hand to seek his achievements. Even before he received London's response, Mornington was already ordering EIC forces to prepare for war. But he was also fine with winning non-violently, and as luck would have it, an opportunity for that cropped up almost immediately. The target was the British regular ally of Hyderabad, and the catalyst, as with so many subsequent expansion opportunities, was a succession crisis. Here, the favored heir found his status challenged by a rival who was supported by Hyderabad's sepoys, trained and led by French mercenaries. In desperation, the heir sought out Mornington, who offered the following deal. The EIC would support the heir's claim and even send their own sepoys to disarm the French ones. But afterwards, the British troops would stay in the capital, and Hyderabad would pay for them. In other words, it was a subsidiary alliance. Recognizing not only the personal, but also the military consequences for friendless Hyderabad if he refused, the heir agreed, and so, in late 1798, one of the top indigenous powers in India smoothly turned into a British vassal. It wasn't even that hard for Mornington to expel the French. Contrary to his own narrative, the French mercenaries were only interested in money, not politics, and so were easily bribed away by, amusingly, granting them EIC shares that they could sell once they returned to Europe. In a single month, Mornington had gained territory that previous rulers had taken years to conquer. But this only served to whet his appetite, as he speculated that other indigenous powers might be just as quote-unquote corrupt as Hyderabad. In any case, the EIC's armies had already been mobilized with another target in mind. In the last part, the chief official of British India, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, had just arrived on the subcontinent, determined to achieve something to advance his political ambitions. Unexpectedly, he had scored an early success when a major indigenous power, Hyderabad, submitted to company rule. Now, Mornington would return to his intended target, the South Indian power of Mysore. In many ways, Mysore was the perfect target for Mornington, who still wasn't sure how much aggression his superiors in Parliament and the EIC would really tolerate. Mysore had fought the British 3 times, kept links with revolutionary France, and had a reputation for torturing Europeans. Its threat had diminished significantly after Britain imposed a punitive peace on it in their last war, but Mornington banked that London would not find a new conflict with it too objectionable. Mysore at this time was ruled by the Muslim Tipu Sultan, whose father had usurped the original Hindu dynasty in the 1760s. Taking advantage of unsettled circumstances, and identifying British India as their main rival, both father and son initiated extensive centralization reforms that aimed to turn Mysore into an economic powerhouse with a Europeanized military to match. Tipu, in particular, was not satisfied with merely sidelining feudal lords nor with creating a new tax bureaucracy. Instead, he also sought to establish factories, merchant convoys, and even overseas colonies. All these changes were bound to trigger discontent amongst Tipu's traditionalist subjects, and so to suppress opposition, he increasingly relied on forced labor, state terror, and Islamic zealotry. The extra resources gained by these reforms were poured back into the Mysorean military, expanding the number of sepoy infantry, repairing forts, founding a navy, and even conducting innovative experiments with rocket artillery. Aware that he needed time for these changes to mature, Tipu sought out defensive alliances against the British with whoever he could find, fellow Indians, fellow Muslims, and revolutionary France. But here, he was to be sorely disappointed. Tipu's neighbors, Hyderabad and the Maratha Empire, were traditional enemies and were happy to see him fall, while the Ottomans and Persians were more interested in keeping Britain's friendship than in defending distant Mysore. And as we've seen, French help was ineffective and positively accelerated the onset of British aggression. On the other side, Mornington was also running into problems as he prepared British India for war. The most serious one was with the Afghans, who were invading India again, raising fears that their cavalry might sweep all the way down the Ganges to Bengal. It would have been quite impossible for British India to start a war with Mysore under such circumstances, but the British found a typically colonial solution for this: bribe the Persians to attack the Afghans and force the latter's recall. Unlike Mysore, British diplomacy worked, and Mornington was soon able to turn his attention back to Tipu. There was also the question of funding, which Mornington solved by raising loans from indigenous merchants and, to the fury of the EIC directors in London, reappropriating the Bengal silver tax that was meant to buy Chinese tea. And finally, Mornington also had to deal with the EIC civil and military bureaucracy, whose officials had been promoted by mercantilists and therefore also shared their opposition to war. In fact, the main reason why Mysore wasn't attacked as soon as Mornington arrived was due to stalling from this quote-unquote deep state, and by now, the Governor-General had finally had enough. In late 1798, he moved to Madras, the presidency primarily responsible for fighting the upcoming war, to oversee things personally and browbeat any civil official who still defied him. As for the military officials, Mornington sent the next best thing: his younger brother Arthur, i.e. the future Duke of Wellington, who at the time led a regiment of European soldiers in India. In a move typical of the political patronage of the time, Mornington inserted Wellington into the staff of the Madras army, both to help with the planning of the Mysore campaign and, more importantly, ensure that its commander, George Harris, actually carried it out. Wellington soon discovered that not all of Harris's excuses were fake. The geography of the upcoming war was well known thanks to previous conflicts. Mysore lies on a plateau that rises steeply in the west and gently in the east. An invasion from the east, i.e. Madras, was therefore the logical strategy, but that meant an inland journey of 500 kilometers, much of it through the frontier zone separating the two powers, which the Mysore light cavalry was sure to devastate as part of their scorched earth campaign. What's more, the whole campaign had to take place between October and March, because after that, the famous Indian monsoon would start flooding rivers and cutting communications. So to defeat Mysore, British forces would need to rapidly generate and maintain offensive momentum, and for that, they needed a comprehensive logistics plan. 3 forces needed to be supplied: the main body of the Madras army, numbering 30,000, a supporting force of 15,000 from Hyderabad, and a 7,000-strong detachment from the Bombay army that would invade from the west. These numbers were roughly equivalent to contemporary European forces, but because Indian armies had looser regulations on baggage and accompanying non-combatants, the true size of the combined British armies was probably more like 100,000. Feeding these moving cities from supplies was no easy feat, and it was in planning for this that Wellington, as part of the Madras staff, first gained a reputation as a logistician and disciplinarian, though in this case he cheated a bit and got his brother to authorize the hiring of mercenary supply trains. Equally importantly, here Wellington also learned the value of intelligence, as he took advantage of the reports pouring in from the feudal lords of Mysore, who sought revenge for Tipu's repression. Ultimately, Harris settled for a safe campaign strategy. The British would use the same route they had used in previous wars to enter Mysore, where they would then aim straight for Tipu's capital, the fortress of Seringapatam. No serious military challenge was anticipated. While the Madras and Mysore sepoys largely came from the same local population, the EIC sepoys were better drilled and were also bolstered by 8,000 European troops, used for the toughest jobs like fortress storming. Mysore's artillery, despite the rockets, was seen as inferior, and its fortresses especially outdated. The only real worry came from its light cavalry, but they were plunderers, not battlers, and British logistics had hopefully neutralized the impact of their scorched earth strategy. So on November 1798, Mornington formally denounced Mysore for collaborating with France, forcing Tipu to face the prospect of fighting a war before his reforms were complete. By now, Mysore had 30,000 sepoys and 15,000 light cavalry, but the former couldn't yet match the British in battle, and there wasn't enough of the latter to stall out the British advance. His diplomacy had failed, and within Mysore, many preferred British colonialism to his continued repression. Seemingly resigned to his downfall, Tipu decided on what was essentially a final stand. His army would conduct token resistance as the British invaded, but afterwards they would withdraw into Seringapatam, where Tipu could only pray for an early monsoon to save him. In the end, the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War was a fairly straightforward affair for the British. Bowing to Mornington's pressure, Harris amazingly set out on February 1799, right before the start of the monsoon. Wellington joined him as commander of the Hyderabad force, a position gained, yet again, due to patronage. A month later, both the Madras and Bombay armies entered Mysore from the east and west, brushing aside the Mysorean sepoys and ignoring the harassment of the Mysorean light cavalry. By April, Harris was at Seringapatam. In early May, the walls were breached and the British promptly rushed in, killing Tipu and sacking the fortress. They did so just in time. A few days later, the long-delayed monsoon finally arrived, flooding the area and forcing a halt to any further operations. The rapid demise of Mysore illustrates some of the problems indigenous rulers faced when resisting European imperialism. In their reviews of the campaign, both Harris and Wellington assessed that Mysore's attempt to adopt European methods had been a fundamental strategic error. By 1799, it had been reforming for 3 decades, yet its military still folded before British Indian forces. Furthermore, Tipu's political centralization had destroyed Mysore's feudal cohesion and encouraged local lords to either defect or not resist. As the British saw it, Tipu should have just fought in the traditional Indian light cavalry manner, which, besides not having the aforementioned problems, also had the advantage of being less familiar to Europeans, and so might have stood a better chance of stalling the British until the monsoon arrived. This analysis has its merits, but it is also Anglo-centric. It ignores that most indigenous powers, Mysore admittedly not being one of them, reformed primarily to fight each other, and in these wars sepoy units often proved very effective against traditional Indian militaries. The British also had a tendency to exaggerate the effects of Indian light cavalry plundering, while overlooking their inability to attack prepared forces or positions. In any case, the British were already developing countermeasures in the form of horse artillery. And finally, Mysore's fall can also be blamed on specific mistakes that Tipu made, rather than being an indictment of the entire project of indigenous reform. At the very least, had Tipu Sultan preemptively submitted to the British, he or his dynasty might have bought the time needed to complete Mysore's transition out of feudalism. After all, that was what Hyderabad did, and as a result, both state and dynasty survived the entire period of British rule. With the capture of Seringapatam and the death of Tipu, the British were now in charge of Mysore. In what was fast becoming an unwelcome pattern of patronage, Wellington was again appointed as governor of the newly conquered territory, prompting angry protests from the more senior military commanders. But in all fairness, Wellington had proven his competence in campaign logistics, and it was expected that he would perform similarly well when it came to colonial administration. Wellington's first task was not anything civilian, however, but instead the suppression of residual resistance within Mysore. Here, the heirs of Tipu Sultan had already done the British a huge service when they agreed to accept the war's outcome, but Mysore was still fundamentally a feudal state, and so, despite the central government's surrender, local lords, including former British allies, now tried to take advantage of events to reassert their former authority. In this, they were joined by many of Tipu's ex-sepoys, many of whom had now become mercenaries needing a new source of employment. By far the most significant movement in this regard was the so-called rebellion of one Dondia Wag, who led a coalition of border lords in the frontier zone between northern Mysore, Hyderabad, and the Maratha Empire. In a sense, what Wag was doing was fairly standard under Indian feudalism, which was for a lord to take advantage of unsettled conditions to expand his own authority, and then use the power gained to extract various benefits and privileges from the ruler. Unfortunately for Wag, he was not dealing with a feudal Indian state, but with the post-feudal British who did not tolerate rival authorities in their own realm. Denouncing Wag's effort as an attempt to restore Tipu Sultan's regime, Wellington set out to destroy him in one of the earliest examples of a colonial counterinsurgency campaign. In doing so, Wellington was confronted by some of the challenges typical to counterinsurgency. First, with only a limited number of troops to secure a vast territory, the British had to rely on local support and therefore had to compete with Wag for quote-unquote hearts and minds. Second, British Indian forces would also be operating within a frontier zone, where the lack of any central authority meant that borders were far less meaningful than they seemed to be on a map. In this case, Wellington was strictly ordered not to violate the territory of the neighboring Maratha Empire, even as Wag's forces crisscrossed the border with virtual impunity. In response to these challenges, Wellington developed what he called his light and quick strategy, which in reality was really just a systematized formulation of what British Indian forces were already doing. The ultimate goal of light and quick, or L&Q, was to suppress open resistance in as short a time as possible, and avoid a drawn-out campaign that would drain both finances and political will. Tactically, L&Q employed fast units like cavalry and horse artillery which, in conjunction with local intelligence, could quickly rush to and attack enemy forces. Operationally, these units would be grouped into several columns, each operating on a separate line of communication, which would fragment enemy concentrations and allow them to be defeated in detail. And finally, on a strategic level, through repeated success in L&Q, British forces would build up a reputation for being inescapable and invincible, thereby winning, or more accurately, psychologically dominating, local hearts and minds and cowing them into stopping further resistance. To this, Wellington added the need to practice quote-unquote fair dealing, which meant both reliably punishing anti-British activity, savagely if needed, and also rewarding pro-British ones. The campaign against Wag was Wellington's first as an independent commander, and it was one where the L&Q strategy served him well. Most of the work was done by 5,000 cavalry split into two columns, but Wellington was also smart enough to support them by re-employing the old spy network that Tipu had built up. An initial thrust in mid-1799 failed, as Wag simply relocated to Maratha territory, only to return once the British withdrew at the height of the monsoon. In mid-1800, Wellington attacked again, but this time he exploited his relationship with his brother, who authorized him to offer the local Maratha lords some land if they made an effort to seal their border. The Marathas agreed, and together the two forces boxed Wag back into Mysore territory. Shorn of his mobility, Wag's days were numbered, and within a few months, both he and his army were destroyed by Wellington's forces. The campaign against Dondia Wag was only the largest of the many minor wars waged by British India between 1799 and 1803, as Mornington extended EIC control over various other frontier zones that had never submitted to any central authority before. From the hill forts of southern India to the walled villages of the middle Ganges, British Indian sepoys marched, fought, and died to secure minor tracts of territory, oftentimes only to do it again next campaign season as the sites were reoccupied over the monsoon. But the end result was the full acknowledgement of British authority over all of its directly or indirectly held possessions, marking an important step in the construction of a Europeanized state on the subcontinent. And at the same time, a few reformists also wanted to use this authority to change Indian society. In the last part, the chief official of British India, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, had just conquered the South Indian power of Mysore and suppressed the resistance of its feudal lords. Now, with unquestioned authority over their territory, Mornington and his reformed-minded colleagues began to use that authority to reorganize feudal Indian society along rational Enlightenment principles, not just to render India more accessible to European exploitation, but also to increase the subcontinent's level of development. Both were ultimately meant to achieve what Mornington had promised his skeptical bosses back in London, a boost to the profit of the East India Company and its shareholders. Mornington had come to British India with two policy directions in mind. First, territorial expansion, and second, reorganizing Indian society to establish a quote-unquote rational and Europeanized order. As a recently conquered territory, Mysore was the perfect testing ground for both. First came the territorial expansion. Accordingly, the British first annexed Mysore's coastline, then awarded border territories to Hyderabad and the Maratha Empire. The remainder was to be turned into a subsidiary ally, and now British officials were free to focus on their other work of societal reorganization. So what was the British goal here? As mentioned in part 1 of the video series, British reformists, following Enlightenment philosophy, believed that the purpose of government was to establish a rational order over society. Furthermore, they equated rational order with the rule of the landed gentry, whose status as both educated aristocrats and local leaders meant that they would best understand and act in the collective interest. This was in contrast to the partisan tyranny that the British associated with central bureaucracies, exemplified in revolutionary France, where society was being repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt depending on who controlled Paris at the time. But before British reformists could even start on their ambition, they first had to answer a basic question: who actually belonged to the Indian landed gentry? In some places, the answer was obvious. Swaths of annexed territory were given to those who had helped the British, while the original Hindu dynasty was restored in subsidiary Mysore alongside the lords that Tipu Sultan had repressed. But in the rest of rural India, the British had the choice of several groups, all of whom held some power under feudalism. There were village leaders whom indigenous rulers had designated to collect tax, village scribes who were designated to audit the collection of the tax, and otherwise unconnected officials whose pay the tax had been earmarked for. Communal, clan, and religious organizations also had a say in village governance, not to mention the various exiles who now petitioned the new regime to restore their former status. Faced with this complicated social mosaic that they had neither the understanding nor manpower to fully oversee, the British ultimately decided to boil it all down to two principles which, not entirely coincidentally, also structured power in rural Britain. First, local leadership and gentryhood would be reserved for those who owned the most local land. Secondly, and more significantly, whether somebody owned land or not depended on whether they had the legal documents that proved their ownership. From a present-day perspective, an emphasis on written documentation might seem like the hallmark of a modern, or rational, legal system. But the rough imposition of this principle upon a largely illiterate society with its own pre-existing feudal traditions inevitably had huge social repercussions. Here, the British insistence on documentation unsurprisingly favored people with access to such things. First, there were the village leaders who, while often illiterate, were rich enough to pay for scribes. Second, there was the caste of literate scribes who were now in an ideal position to demonstrate or even forge land claims. And third, there was the caste of equally literate Brahmins who could now also secure and expand the holdings of their religious institutions. Thanks to the new principles set out by British reformism, from here on out all three groups, as the new gentry class of India, would not only cement their position at the top of the social and caste hierarchy, but, similar to the enclosure movement that was gaining steam in Britain at the time, they would also abuse their literacy advantage to expropriate land that, under feudalism, was commonly or independently owned. All this would largely come at the expense of the illiterate peasants and lower castes, whose unwritten rights and traditions largely went unrecognized under the British legal system. As a result, most were either forced out into increasingly unproductive lands, or else became tenant farmers who now had to pay rent to the gentry on top of their existing burdens. Still, however imperfectly, the British now had their landed gentry, so the next step was to incentivize this class to cooperate with the overarching goal of colonial exploitation. In most cases, this was done via a basic bargain. If the gentry would facilitate British administration and especially help collect British taxes, the British would step back and let them assume near unchecked powers over local life. This was a marked shift from feudal practice, where rulers often intervened in favor of the peasants to balance out the feudal lords. The British bargain not only co-opted the gentry into being a free local government for British India, but was also aligned with what reformists initially saw as the ideal societal order. As a result, throughout this period, British India decentralized power at the local level, undoing much of the progress that indigenous states had made in reducing the power of the feudal lords. Many British officials trumpeted this process as a gift to the Indian populace, seeing it as removing the onerous burdens of the quote-unquote corrupt indigenous governments. In reality, Indian peasants quickly discovered that these were replaced by the even more onerous burdens of the local gentry, ranging from extortionate rents to compulsory services to making the poor pay the lion's share of the local tax quota. So the local gentry wasn't as socially responsible as idealized, but that wasn't meant to be the only upside to a reformist order. In freeing the gentry from the arbitrary demands of central government, British reformists also expected that the former would now proactively develop their lands, leading to an improvement in the British Indian economy, as well as for EIC profits. This thinking lay behind another social innovation that the British sought to implement in India: secure property rights. Under Indian feudalism, lords were not guaranteed ownership over their lands. Instead, they only had a grant from the ruler, who technically could revoke it at any time. To the British, such a system was inherently arbitrary and discouraged the gentry from making long-term improvements to their lands, so they sought to rectify this via yet another bargain with them. The most famous example of such a bargain was the so-called permanent settlement of Bengal in the 1790s, where the British pledged never to arbitrarily expropriate gentry land, so long as the gentry again paid the land tax on time. In fact, the EIC even agreed never to increase the land tax, which might seem counterintuitive for exploitation, but this was because the British expected that, thanks to the guarantees contained within the permanent settlement, the gentry would now feel secure enough to develop Bengal into a significant market for taxable EIC goods. Just like the emphasis on documentation, secure property rights are regarded as a hallmark for a modern or rational economy. But the rough way in which the British implemented this concept in Bengal again led to huge repercussions that ultimately contributed to a major failure of expectations. The problem again lay in the reformist over-idealization of what the gentry was willing to do. More so than in Europe, India's agricultural productivity depended on a well-maintained irrigation infrastructure to manage the often unpredictable monsoons. Under feudalism, the ruler was responsible for their maintenance, but now, the British believed that, having introduced secure property rights, they could pass on this burden onto the newly incentivized gentry instead. In doing so, they overlooked the basic economic failure, albeit poorly understood at the time, known as the free rider problem. Since the presence of irrigation infrastructure provided equal benefits to everyone regardless of contribution, every gentleman was incentivized to shirk responsibility for its maintenance and rely on others to contribute instead. So eventually, nobody maintained anything, and the result was general agriculture decay and a steep decline in peasant conditions. By the time Governor-General Mornington was in charge during the 1800s, the impoverishment of the Bengal peasantry was already too embarrassing for the British to replicate the permanent settlement for southern India. Instead, officials introduced an adjusted system where the EIC, rather than letting the gentry seize everything, would instead keep some of the land to directly rent it out to peasants. For this system to work, the EIC had to know what land it actually owned, and so Mornington's officials, including his brother Wellington, began surveying every land plot under their control, kicking off a monster project that would take almost 7 decades to finish. As a side effect, this will also give British India an unprecedented amount of data on the subcontinent, laying the groundwork for modern policy-making based on analysis of objective evidence, which marked yet another step in the Europeanization of South Asian government. But despite all the work, however, Mornington's new reformist system still failed to meet expectations. This time, it was not over-idealism which was to blame, but instead cold, hard politics. The British Indian gentry rightly saw these surveys and direct rentals as an attempt to curb or bypass their power, and so, just like in feudal times, they mobilized an opposition, threatening disobedience or even rebellion. By this time, British officials were fully aware of how the gentry abused the peasantry, though they still blamed it on corruption rather than on anything they themselves did. But at the same time, the British also understood that their rule over India was easiest achieved if they kept to the initial gentry bargains. So the British re-diluted their system to favor the gentry, most notably by placing the latter back in charge of collecting the rents, and as a result, southern India also spiraled into a cycle of rural abuse, debt, and peasant misery. Behind the repeated policy and social failures was the EIC's fundamental need to exploit the subcontinent for profit. The company demanded high taxes from both the gentry and peasantry, with little relief even during times of severe economic crisis. But the way colonial exploitation worked was significantly more sophisticated than the orgy of pillage that British rule is often caricatured as. Rather, just like colonial America, British officials used India as a policy lab where they could experiment with local society and, hopefully, find ways to improve administration efficiency or stimulate development. After all, it was much better to fatten the golden goose than to kill it outright, and to that end, the British introduced various social innovations whose worth is still recognized today as part of South Asia's transition into so-called modernity. In that case, why did British colonialism in India fall so short of the reformist ideal, especially given the British success in developing colonial America? Perhaps the biggest difference is that, unlike in America, the British had neither the capability nor the intention to erase South Indian indigenous society and start off with a blank slate. That meant that, instead of societal construction, the British in India were trying to do societal reorganization, a task whose complexity was arguably beyond the capabilities of any government at the time. When British Indian officials tried to implement their pro-gentry utopia, they neither had the knowledge to fully appreciate the ramifications of their policies, nor the administrative capacity to ensure that the local gentry conformed to their expectations. As such, instead of British policies changing Indian society towards reformist ideals, British policies instead were used by local elites to intensify India's feudal and hierarchical structures. The result was an India that was the opposite of what reformists intended. Rural abuse and underinvestment became commonplace, and in their wake came misery, debt slavery, and famine. In the coming decades, frequent war, British imports, and finally industrial restrictions would further add to the subcontinent's woes, ultimately leading to deurbanization, stagnation, and grinding poverty. As an example, the tax revenue Tipu Sultan collected from Mysore in 1799 would not be reached again until 1860. Many British Indian officials were genuinely upset at these results, which implied that British rule was inferior to what had come before. But there was no question of returning to feudalism, nor of stopping colonial exploitation. Instead, the only solution was further reform, and already in Mornington's day, many had begun to argue that India's condition would improve once Parliament abolished the EIC's monopoly over subcontinental trade. In any case, the British were also hard at work reforming India's regional order, as Mornington endeavored to replace the existing feudal hierarchy with a new, Europeanized and British-led one. In 2 short years, Mornington had eliminated 2 of India's top indigenous powers, Hyderabad through vassalization, Mysore through conquest. This feat was more than enough to place him amongst the subcontinent's greatest conquerors, but the Governor-General's ambitions, much like his French contemporary Napoleon, were boundless. In fact, shortly after the conquest of Mysore, Mornington received something that he interpreted as an insulting reminder of his insignificance. Prime Minister Pitt and the British government had honored him with a new aristocratic title, but it was one under the less prestigious Peerage of Ireland, rather than that of Great Britain. Furious, Mornington decided that he needed more achievements in the form of conquests and annexations. But to be fair, anger was not his only reason for resuming expansion. After all, the reformist project to Europeanize India was in full swing, and was hardly compatible with British India's continued subservience to the existing feudal regional order. The only real question was, who to target first? Sensibly, Mornington first targeted the most vulnerable members of the regional order, the subsidiary allies of the EIC. On paper, these states had no real ability to act against the British, but they were still Indian states whose idea of legitimate behavior was rooted within Indian, not European, political culture. And as mentioned in Part 1, a characteristic of Indian political culture was its comparatively relaxed attitude with regards to information, with courts and officials regularly sharing news and gossip with other states, even rivals. To those used to it, this was a perfectly reasonable way to manage relations, build trust, and reduce misunderstanding, and up until now, the British were willing to tolerate this practice. Given this, it was standard for these subsidiary allies, particularly in southern India, to maintain contact with Tipu Sultan throughout the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. But Mornington wanted an excuse, and such behavior provided the best justification, from a European perspective, for what he was about to do. Denouncing the contacts of these subsidiary allies as quote-unquote treason, Mornington demanded, as punishment, that their rulers transfer control over their entire administration to the EIC. With no real means of resistance, the rulers folded, and much of what was once only indirectly held in southern India now fell under direct British rule. A similar accusation also led to the annexation of much of the Middle Ganges in northern India, with the offending contact this time being with the Afghans. In the process, the British sent out a clear signal. From here on out, subsidiary allies were to behave according to European standards of political behavior. This was perhaps not the best advertisement for being a British subsidiary ally, but undeterred, Mornington still hoped to acquire more of them. As the case of Hyderabad showed, a succession crisis was a particularly perilous time for any Indian prince or state, and as such represented an ideal opportunity for the British to present their demands up to and including vassalization. This time, the succession crisis was in Gujarat and western India, which was nominally part of the Maratha Empire. When Sun asked the British to support a succession, Mornington sent in the Bombay Army along with a subsidiary alliance request, and soon yet another slice of India came under indirect EIC control. Mornington did not neglect his Europeanizing mission. Gujarat was specifically asked to stop any further independent contact with their Maratha overlord, and instead rely on British India to transmit any future communications. Amidst all this subcontinental activity, it can be difficult to remember that Britain was still locked in a broader struggle against revolutionary France, but that war did occasionally intrude into Mornington's plans. Perhaps the most significant episode occurred in late 1800, when Mornington was ordered to send a detachment to the southern island of Ceylon, where it could then operate against French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies around the Indian Ocean. This was a low-risk, high-plunder job, and accordingly, Mornington again tried to place his brother Wellington in command. But this time, the payout was too high for the senior commanders to accept this patronage abuse, and Wellington was forced into a humiliating climb-down. The detachment was eventually sent to French-occupied Egypt, where it played a minor role in restoring that territory to the Ottoman Empire. Far more important to Mornington was the situation back at the home front, since his position as Governor-General relied entirely on the continued patronage of Prime Minister Pitt. But in early 1801, Pitt abruptly resigned as Prime Minister over the fallout arising from the union of Great Britain and Ireland, and as a result, Mornington's political cover disappeared overnight. Almost immediately, the directors of the EIC, who as mercantilists had always opposed Mornington's reformist and expansionist policies, began to interfere with the Governor-General's plans. They vetoed his proposals for further colonial reforms, and even began removing reformist officials from office, including another brother of the Governor-General himself. Things got so bad that, in 1802, Mornington would write the first of several threatened resignations, hoping to buy some more time to fulfill just another ambition in India. And this one would, undoubtedly, be his biggest challenge to date. And the last part, the British had, for better or for worse, begun their reorganization of feudal Indian society, from the establishment of a landed gentry class to the insistence that everybody follow European standards of political behavior. At the same time, British India continued acquiring and absorbing subsidiary allies, extending its reach further and further into the subcontinent. Despite these achievements, however, the chief official of British India, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, remained unsatisfied. In fact, with the downfall of his political patron back in Britain, he was now under increasing time pressure to fulfill his ambitions before his bosses in the East India Company removed him from office. This dynamic might have pushed Mornington to make his boldest move yet, an attempt to impose his authority over the great lords of the Maratha Empire. To be fair, Mornington's aggression was not the sole cause of the Second Anglo-Maratha War. Ever since the 1750s, the Maratha Empire, which dominated most of central, northern, and inland India, had entered into a prolonged political decay. First, the emperor lost power to his prime minister or Peshwa. Then, the Peshwa lost power to his subordinates, who became independent lords in all but name. By the 1800s, the empire had practically broken up into 4 domains, each paying only the most nominal lip service to Maratha unity. The Peshwa controlled the empire's southwest, while to his northeast lay the lands of the Holkar dynasty. The north, including the city of Delhi, was ruled by the Shinde dynasty, while a branch of the imperial house of BHONSLE dominated the empire's relatively poor east. This state of affairs has often been described as a Maratha confederacy, but by the 1800s, this term had become misleading. Unlike contemporary confederacies like Switzerland, by this time, the Peshwa and his central government had, basically, not even a sliver of authority over the lords, and in fact, were often bullied or even attacked by the latter. Despite this, Mornington and his officials continued to see the Marathas as a confederacy, and in doing so, fell into a conceptual trap. By believing that the Maratha lords were still part of a political hierarchy under the Peshwa, it naturally followed that, by seizing the Peshwa, the British would get to control all the Maratha lords. This was a basic misunderstanding of Maratha politics that seems to have occurred in spite of the extensive British spy effort, as we will see, and it goes to show that no amount of intelligence will be helpful if the interpretation of said intelligence is fundamentally flawed. This would not be the only time that the British made this mistake in the upcoming war. Turning back to the Marathas, similar to the other indigenous powers, throughout the late 18th century, the relentless competition between the lords drove each to begin centralizing their governments, both to boost taxation and to create Europeanized militaries with the help of European mercenaries. Out of the 4, Shinde and Holkar had made the most progress thanks to the relative wealth of their lands. By 1800, both states could each field at least 10,000 Europeanized sepoys, on top of an even larger number of traditional Indian light cavalry. Inevitably, the two became bitter rivals in the struggle for subcontinental hegemony. A key part of this struggle centered around control over the domain of the young Peshwa, Bajirao II. Initially, the ruler or Maharaja of the Shindes, Daulat Rao, held sway thanks to his alliance with Bajirao's regent. But in early 1800, said regent died, and a newly freed Bajirao began to plot Shinde's expulsion as well. Naturally, for this task, the Peshwa sought out the Holkars and their Maharaja, Yashwant Rao. Holkar went to war with Shinde in early 1801. Initially, operations were limited to the traditional light cavalry raiding along their mutual frontier zone, but in 1802, the Peshwa abruptly defected back to Shinde's side. In response, Holkar mobilized his sepoys and marched towards Bajirao's capital of Pune, where he defeated the combined Peshwa and Shinde armies, chased Bajirao away, and installed his own candidate as the new Peshwa. Dethroned and in grave personal danger, Bajirao fled to the Maratha port of Bassein, near British Bombay, and petitioned Mornington to restore him to power. On the surface, to have a ruler, or as Mornington saw it, the ruler, of the Marathas deep in Britain's debt was the opportunity of a lifetime. But with the political winds changing back in London, everybody could see that the Governor-General might not be in office for much longer, and as such, they began to voice different opinions. Even Mornington's own brother, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, cautioned that the Maratha Empire was too quote-unquote rebellious to be a useful ally, and stabilizing it would spread British Indian forces dangerously thin across the subcontinent. As mentioned before, neither the pro nor anti-intervention factions really appreciated that vassalizing the Peshwa would only get them a limited chunk of Western India, rather than the whole empire. Regardless of the strengthening domestic opposition, Mornington was still in charge, and so, on the last day of 1802, he and Baji Rao signed what was to be known as the Treaty of Bassein. In it, the British pledged to restore Baji Rao as Peshwa, and in return, Baji Rao pledged to expel all French personnel from the Maratha Empire, allow an EIC garrison at the capital Pune, and let the British dictate Maratha diplomacy. In so doing, the treaty turned the Peshwa into a British subsidiary ally, and by Mornington's reckoning, that gave him nominal control over the entire empire and by extension, almost all of South Asia. Whether this would become actual reality depended, of course, on the success of the upcoming intervention. For this, Mornington asked the Madras army to provide a 7,000-man contingent, including 2,000 Europeans, and he further sent another 2,000 sepoys from newly vassalized Mysore. Once again, Wellington was put in command of this force, and while this decision was objectively sound, given Wellington's experience of the region during the Dondy-Awag campaign, Mornington's blatant patronage was increasingly galling to senior officers, and as a result, it triggered a cascade of resignations within the Madras army, including its commander-in-chief himself. Undeterred, in March 1803, Wellington set off to restore Baji Rao as Peshwa. As expected, the connections he had built up with the local Maratha lords served him well, and the British met no resistance throughout their month-long campaign. Wellington even got the chance to demonstrate the power of his light and quick strategy, as his cavalry dashed for Pune in the final stretch, surprising Holkar into abandoning the city without a fight. As a result, Baji Rao effortlessly reclaimed his throne in May 1803, and the way was open for the British to, equally effortlessly, become the undisputed hegemons of India. At least, that was how the British assumed things would turn out. With Peshwa Baji Rao restored in Pune, the British now had the displeasure of belatedly discovering that control over him meant very little when it came to vassalizing the other Maratha lords. Part of this was because the Peshwa himself had not regained his throne only to become a British puppet, and as such provided very little help. But in any case, the great lords of the empire were hardly going to hand over their power at the command of Baji Rao, whose authority they, at the best of times, barely acknowledged. Instead, with Holkar withdrawing back to his lands, Shinde and BHONSLE now began marshalling their armies near the Peshwa's border, drawing out vassalization negotiations with the British in a bid to buy more time to prepare. At first, Mornington played along, but his initial optimism eroded over the next 2 months of fruitless and increasingly deceptive talk. Despite this, his overarching goal remained unchanged. If the Maratha lords would not be vassalized through diplomacy, then the British would impose it on them through force. So in August 1803, Mornington finally delivered an ultimatum to both Shinde and BHONSLE, demanding that they either demobilize immediately or else face war. Neither leader complied, and so a few days later, the Second Anglo-Maratha War began. The war between British India and the Marathas was to be fought across the entire empire, but the decisive campaigns would occur within the 2 separate theatres of northern and west-central India respectively. The northern or Hindustani theatre was dominated by the upper Ganges plain and included the Mughal capital of Delhi, and would see the EIC's Bengal army advance against half of Shinde's force. That campaign will be the subject of the next chapter. The focus of this chapter will be on the West Central or Deccan theatre. This was where the Peshwa's capital of Pune was, as well as where half of Shinde's force and all of BHONSLE's had initially gathered. The region was the traditional military route between northern and southern India, and as such was dominated by some of the subcontinent's most renowned forts, each overlooking one of the many rivers that crisscrossed the area. By 1803, however, these fortresses, mostly held by Shinde, had become quite obsolete to modern artillery, and a major monsoonal drought meant that the rivers were not as impassable as they typically were. Instead, the real limiting factor would be the spiking logistics costs due to drought-induced crop failure, which pushed both the Marathas and especially the British to seek a quick decision before the financial strain became unbearable. As for forces, Wellington had with him the 10,000-strong EIC contingent that had restored the Peshwa, and on top of that, he now requested a further 10,000 cavalry from Hyderabad. Opposing him was the combined army of Shinde and BHONSLE, consisting of 15,000 sepoys and 40,000 light cavalry. These impressive Maratha numbers, however, belied a serious problem that was rapidly atrophying their power. As the prospect of actual fighting loomed, many mercenaries, both British and non-British, began to resign from Maratha service. The EIC encouraged and even managed this process, with the most dramatic results occurring over the course of the Hindustan campaign. But even in the Deccan, the loss of mercenary officers sharply reduced the tactical cohesion of Maratha units, while Wellington benefited from the operational intelligence these defectors often provided. But as mentioned before, all the intelligence in the world cannot help if the interpretation of said intelligence is flawed. Mornington made this mistake in the previous chapter. Now, it was his brother's turn to get the Marathas wrong. This time, the mistake was military. Having never really observed Maratha forces in battle, Wellington assumed that they would just be like what he had seen at Mysore, with below-average infantry and artillery, and above-average light cavalry. Based on this, Wellington expected that the Marathas would deploy a light cavalry-centric strategy, namely the wide-ranging plunder raids that the British had repeatedly insisted was the best strategy for indigenous militaries. Wellington devised his counter-strategy on that basis, which was a version of his light and quick strategy. Fully expecting that catching the Marathas would be far more difficult than defeating them in battle, Wellington organized his primary force to prioritize speed and aggression, rather than firepower, which was to be reserved for the siege train. His primary force would further split itself into two columns to cover as much land as possible, with the goal being to quickly identify and pin down enemy concentrations before defeating them in decisive battle. It was a strategy that worked well against the likes of Dhoondiah Wag, but that was precisely the problem. The Marathas were not like Dhoondiah Wag. While Shinde and especially BHONSLE did plan to raid the British rear, they primarily sought to repel the British through victory in pitched battle. This reflected Maratha confidence in their mercenary-trained sepoys, who not only fought tenaciously as infantry but, significantly, often outperformed the British when it came to handling artillery. In retrospect, the two rulers probably underestimated the damage that the mercenary exodus was doing to their units, but, being on the strategic defensive, they probably assumed that they could train up adequate replacements while they waited for Wellington's army to arrive. The start of the war in August 1803 saw Wellington's army opposite Ahmednagar, the first major fort north of the Peshwa's capital Pune. Historically formidable, Ahmednagar was by now too obsolete and well scouted out for Shinde to commit more than a token garrison to its defense, whom Wellington promptly rehired to serve British India after an initial show of force. Following his light and quick strategy, Wellington now split his army into two lightly armed columns and moved northeast towards the estimated position of the Maratha army near Aurangabad, and in the process taking multiple detours to stop Maratha cavalry from raiding Peshwa or Hyderabad lands. As a result, for the next 2 months, the British grew dangerously comfortable with both the idea of dispersing their forces and the belief that the Marathas would stick to traditional light cavalry warfare. Finally, in late September, Wellington had narrowed down the location of the Maratha army to the village of Bokardhan, and so his two columns, still marching separately, were ordered to reconcentrate there. But as his own column was moving towards Bokardhan, Wellington received updated intelligence that revealed that the 50,000-strong Maratha army, including Shinde's 10,000 sepoys, was actually concentrated not far from where he was, at the village of Asai. At this point, Wellington only had about 10,000 troops with him, half of whom were irregular cavalry unsuited for battle. But everything up to this point, from his preconceived notions to his campaign experience, had led Wellington to see the Maratha infantry as vastly inferior to British arms. He therefore boldly ordered his outnumbered column to attack. The resulting Battle of Assaye shattered Wellington's delusions regarding the Marathas. He first tried a flanking approach, only for the Maratha sepoys to redeploy and force him into a frontal assault instead. The Maratha artillery then opened fire, silencing the light British cannon before turning their fury upon the advancing infantry. The Europeans on the right flank, in particular, were decimated, and only by throwing in his entire reserve and dashing around to rally his troops did Wellington stabilize his lines enough to get them to the Maratha positions. At that point, the quality of the British Indian troops finally began to tell, and the Marathas were eventually forced to retreat. In the end, almost 15% of Wellington's column, or 1,500 men, became casualties in the battle. Shinde and BHONSLE lost about 6,000 total, mostly from the routing baggage train rather than the sepoys themselves. Had the Marathas been in less disarray due to the mercenary exodus, or had Wellington shown poorer crisis leadership, it's possible that the British would have been defeated outright. But in any event, the Battle of Assaye was an entirely unnecessary risk, one that Wellington took only because he had the wrong idea of how his enemy fought. Wellington learned from the experience, and in the weeks after Assaye, he adjusted his strategy to his updated assessment of Maratha capabilities. No longer would he rush to battle the enemy. Instead, Wellington's light forces would now refocus their efforts on intercepting Maratha raiders, denying them the plunder needed to pay for the rest of Shinde and BHONSLE's force. At the same time, Wellington would also send the unbloodied half of his force to capture more of Shinde's forts, seizing the treasures within and extorting the local population to neutralize them as a resource base. All the while, the EIC's offer to rehire Maratha sepoys would remain open, and as Shinde and BHONSLE's funds drained away, more and more of their former soldiers would decide to accept the British deal. By late November, Shinde had to resort to the same diplomatic ruse that he had used at the start of the war. He asked Wellington for an armistice, hoping to use it to relocate the Marathas to better logistical ground. Wellington agreed, but the British were not to be fooled twice. Taking his entire army this time, Wellington marched towards Shinde's position, and found the latter army joined up with BHONSLE's at Argaon in contravention of armistice terms. The British accordingly attacked, and while they were initially handled roughly by the Maratha artillery again, this time, with better numbers on their side, the result was a definitive victory that shattered Shinde's force in the Deccan. All that was left to do was for Wellington to press the advance up to BHONSLE's fortress at Gawalgar, which was quickly stormed and emptied of all its treasures. Not long after, with few resources left to maintain their existing force, to say nothing of replacing past losses, Shinde and BHONSLE finally decided to sue for peace. The Deccan campaign marked the height of Wellington's career in India, though as we've seen, it was hardly a stellar performance from the future Iron Duke. Nevertheless, his strategy achieved what it needed to do in the theater. In 5 months, British India had seized overall control of the Deccan and its military routes, strengthening its protection and domination of both Hyderabad and the Maratha Peshwa. Mornington had no greater ambitions for this region which, after all, was meant to be a sideshow to the main event occurring up north. As implied in the previous chapters, when Mornington pondered whether to vassalize the Maratha Peshwa or not, he was not really focused on the value of the Peshwa's fairly marginal and war-torn domain. Instead, he was far more interested in the Maratha holdings in the upper Ganges plain, especially the region around Delhi, then known as Hindustan. Fabled for its wealth and splendor, Mornington expected that Hindustan's capture would more than cover all the extra costs incurred during his governor-generalship, and therefore finally redeem his reformist policies in the eyes of his mercantilist bosses back in London. Equally importantly, Delhi was also where the Mughal emperor was, and while, as mentioned in Part 1, the emperor wielded little actual power, controlling him would let the British channel his great prestige to legitimize their rule throughout the subcontinent. Furthermore, though the British didn't know this at the time, controlling Hindustan would also allow the British to dominate the petty kings of neighboring Rajputana, whose tribute, fueled by the regional caravan trade network, was actually an easier source of income than Hindustan, whose wealth was largely dispersed amongst the feudal aristocracy. At the start of August 1803, Hindustan was held by the great Maratha lord, Daulat Rao Shinde, who used its aforementioned advantages to field a formidable sepoy army, half of which we've already seen in the Deccan. The other half of Shinde's force, numbering 15,000 sepoys and 20,000 light cavalry, was under the command of the French mercenary general Péron, who was now tasked with defending the region against the invasion of the EIC's Bengal army. Led by General Gerard Lake, the Bengal army, numbering about 10,000 soldiers, including several thousand Europeans, had spent much of 1802 suppressing a rebellion right on the Hindustani border, so the outbreak of war saw it well positioned for an immediate attack, just like in the Deccan. But unlike Wellington, Lake seems to have held a respectful opinion of Maratha capabilities from the start. This is not too surprising, given that both his and Shinde's sepoys basically came from the same population, and in many cases had even served in the opposing army. But no matter where it came from, Lake's realistic enemy assessment would do much to create an effective strategy for the upcoming campaign. True to its name, the Upper Ganges Plain is relatively flat throughout, with deserts or hills only emerging at the edges. The great rivers of the region, the Ganges in the north, the Yamuna in the center, and the Chambal to the south, were therefore the main obstacles to movement, but the monsoonal drought that was afflicting the Deccan at this time was also afflicting the region, which meant that the rivers posed no real challenge for either side. Similarly, the defenses of the region, including the famous Red Forts of Delhi and Agra, were hopelessly obsolete, given modern artillery and the limited number of troops fielded by both sides. So there was little stopping Lake from going where he pleased, but the same also held for the other side, with the Marathas or any other opportunistic ruler on the borderlands potentially able to strike wherever, whenever. Mornington had already given Lake a potential out by allowing the Bengal army to prioritize capturing Delhi over the defense of even Bengal itself. Nevertheless, similar to the underlying logic behind Wellington's light and quick strategy, Lake ultimately decided that aggression right from the start would give him the best chance to drive events towards a quick decision rather than a long, expensive stalemate. Unlike Wellington's initial instincts, however, Lake was not about to charge straight at the Maratha army. Rather, more like Wellington's later instincts, Lake would focus first on the denial of Maratha raiding and the capture of local forts, pinning down and starving out Shinde's soldiers in the process until the Bengal army could easily defeat them with minimal risk. Lake's strategy would be helped by a truly impressive example of military subversion from Mornington. Despite pushing for the Europeanization of the subcontinent, the Governor-General was nevertheless interested in exploiting the mercenary attitude prevalent in South Asian military culture at the time, especially the practice of rehiring soldiers to fight for a new side. And of course, the people who most exemplified this attitude were the European mercenaries, in fact, for whom profit was the sole purpose of their service. Mornington had used subversion from the moment he arrived in India, but what he was about to do in Hindustan dwarfed anything done previously. Even before the Maratha War broke out, and while his emissaries were still negotiating with Shinde, Mornington's spies had already made secret offers to the mercenary leaders of Hindustan, up to and including the Maratha commander, General Péron himself. Raising the real fear of an unprofitable death on one hand, while offering a wad of EIC shares to be sold back in Europe on the other, Mornington had, in fact, secured Péron's allegiance a full 2 months before hostilities began. Similar efforts occurred at all levels of the mercenary hierarchy, triggering a cascade of defections and self-sabotage that a bewildered Shinde, despite his best efforts, was unable to stop. Like in the Deccan campaign, the results severely compromised Maratha tactical cohesion, but this was not the only outcome of Mornington's subversion in Hindustan. After war broke out in August 1803, Lake spent a month finalizing his preparations before advancing first against the major fort of Aligarh. On the way, he clashed with Shinde's army under the compromised General Perron, who put up a token resistance before falling back. This behavior finally confirmed Perron's unreliability to Shinde, and in response, the new Maratha lord hastily appointed a new French mercenary, Bourquin, to command. But unbeknownst to Shinde, this introduced an entirely new dynamic into the Maratha army, that of the French Revolution, since Bourquin supported the revolution while most of his compatriots remained royalist. As a result, the Maratha army in Hindustan split into pro- and anti-Bourquin factions, stoking mutual suspicion and hostility amongst the sepoys that persisted even after the French had left. Meanwhile, Lake had taken advantage of all this to storm Aligarh in a tough fight, after which he steadily proceeded up the road to Delhi. By mid-September, Bourquin was finally forced to offer battle before the city's gates, and while the individual Maratha sepoy and especially artilleryman fought capably, their tattered command hardly exercised any overall control, and the British were able to use a feint retreat to lure the Marathas out and then decimate them. Delhi surrendered a few days later, and with it, British India not only became the new regents for the Mughal emperor, but also obtained the surrender of a few sepoy units and even Bourquin himself, who was now sent back to Europe along with Perron. Lake remained in Delhi for a while longer, rehiring Shinde's sepoys to serve in the garrisons while also conducting diplomacy with neighboring Rajput rulers. Finally, in early October, he marched to capture the second city of Hindustan, Agra. There, he was again met with a Maratha army in chaos, as the sepoys inside Agra's Red Fort locked out the reinforcements sent to strengthen them. Inevitably, both armies were soon defeated in detail, and with Agra's fall, Lake was now in overall control of Hindustan, having suffered barely more casualties than Wellington had done at the Battle of Vasai alone. All that was left to do was to remove the remnants of Shinde's army from the region, which occurred a few days later, as Lake located and attacked the retreating Marathas at Laswari. Once again, the individual Maratha soldier fought hard, but by this time they were far too small and demoralized to do anything more than delay the inevitable. With their defeat and subsequent dispersal, Shinde's power was definitively broken, not just in Hindustan, but also in Rajputana, whose petty rulers now flocked to place themselves under EIC protection. The bulk of British India's military effort during the Second Anglo-Maratha War was made in the Deccan and Hindustan campaigns, but all across central India, small detachments also launched their own attacks, particularly on the coasts, which Mornington wanted sealed off from non-British influence. By the end of December 1803, British India had reached a territorial extent not seen since the height of Mughal rule a century before. It directly or indirectly controlled almost everything between Delhi and the subcontinent's southern tip, and between Gujarat to Bengal. This represented more than a quadrupling of EIC territory, and all this was achieved within a mere 6 years. At this point, it must have seemed that all there was left for Mornington to do was to formally declare the EIC's full hegemony. With the might of Shinde and BHONSLE broken, both rulers had no choice but to sign subsidiary alliance treaties with British India. And despite the stated casus belli of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, which was to get the Maratha lords to submit to the authority of the vassalized Peshwa, the treaties also formalized the breakup of the Maratha Empire, as they sharply limited the Peshwa's power over the defeated lords, while mandating that all future communication between them be conducted via the British. and with the vassalization of the Marathas, there was really nobody else on the subcontinent with the ability to even approach the power that Mornington now wielded. But all was not as it seemed, and in fact, Mornington was slowly being overwhelmed by a multitude of problems. First, he was increasingly at odds with his officials and even his brother Wellington, who by now were fully opposed to further expansion and the overextension of EIC resources that it entailed. Second, the first reports on Hindustan were also coming in, and they definitely did not show the region as the land of easy tax and tribute that Mornington portrayed it as. This directly led to the third problem, as the enraged directors of the EIC, furious at being duped again, were now lobbying the new Prime Minister to remove Mornington, and slowly but surely, they were succeeding. But fourth, and perhaps most ominously, the British were rather mistaken in assuming that they had secured full control over the entire Maratha Empire. After all, there was still one domain that they had not formally subjugated yet, that of Holkar. In the last part, British India had, within a year, first vassalized the nominal Maratha leader or Peshwa, and then destroyed the Europeanized armies of the Maratha lords Shinde and Bhonsle. In the process, the British gained control of not just the core Maratha territories in central India, but also the northern regions of Hindustan and Rajputana, including the Mughal emperor in Delhi. At this point, the chief official of British India, Richard Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, might have finally considered his expansionist ambitions fulfilled. But conquering all this land was only half the equation. The new territories also had to be defended and held. And this was easier said than done, since British Indian forces were now stretched thin throughout the subcontinent, and Mornington's bosses in the EIC refused to let him hire any more. This was especially dangerous, considering that the British had not actually defeated all the Maratha domains. There was still one left, that of Holkar. The Holkars, under their leader Yashwantrao, had actually been the first to confront British India during this period. After all, it was their army that British Indian forces chased away during the latter's restoration of the Maratha Peshwa Bajirao. But when the British later fought Shinde and Bhonsle, Holkar stayed aloof from the fighting raging about his borders. Presumably, having no love for either the British or his dynastic rival Shinde, Holkar expected the two to lock themselves into an exhausting stalemate, at which point he would swoop in and take whatever he pleased. As such, the sweeping and rapid British victory was an extremely unwelcome surprise for Holkar, who now not only lost the chance to profit at the expense of his rivals, but also faced the prospect of becoming subject to Mornington's rule through the vassalization of his nominal liege, the Maratha Peshwa. Already, by December 1803, the British Bengal army, which had just conquered Hindustan, was now pushing in from the north, both to secure the allegiance of the nearby Rajput rulers and to pressure Holkar to formally submit, like Shinde and Bhonsle had already done. Holkar refused to go quietly. On the contrary, in February 1804, a mere 2 months after Shinde and Bhonsle agreed to become subsidiary allies of British India, Holkar issued an ultimatum to Mornington: give up both Hindustan and Rajputana to Holkar, and on top of that, pay a hefty sum as tribute. Unsurprisingly, the British refused, and so the next phase of the Second Anglo-Maratha War began. The theatre of the new war was initially centered southwest of the former Hindustan theatre. Unlike Hindustan's plains, however, the hills and rivers of this new region were far more limiting to military movement. In particular, the city-state of Kota was a key point of control, whose possession would box Holkar in and eventually starve his domain out. But by now, it was not only the Marathas who would be starving, for the monsoonal drought and crop failure that had ravaged South Asia in 1803 was continuing into 1804, and already the British were having trouble collecting supplies for their planned operations. Regardless, the British strategy was to be a regional version of what had worked in the previous Hindustan and Deccan campaigns. First, the British would box Holkar in, preventing him from launching the plunder raids needed to pay his soldiers. As mentioned, the main effort in this regard would center on Kota, which the 10,000-strong Bengal army would secure from the north. After this was done, the army, in conjunction with supporting forces from Gujarat in the west and the Deccan in the south, would march on Holkar's capital, Indore, and force him to terms. This was a fairly obvious strategy that Holkar would have anticipated. He also had the benefit of learning from Shinde and BHONSLE's experiences, and from that, concluding that fighting an infantry battle with the British would likely only result in rapid defeat. So Holkar decided to return to traditional Indian war-fighting methods. Rather than relying on his 10,000-strong sepoys as he did in prior wars, Holkar instead recruited 15,000 light cavalry, intending to use them to outmaneuver and raid the British until the latter gave up. To get this to work, Holkar would have to abandon every fixed position that he had, up to and including his capital. Nevertheless, his strategy best exploited the overstretched condition of British Indian forces at the time. On the one hand, his cavalry could isolate and destroy overstretched enemy units. On the other, by riding into territories that Mornington had only recently conquered, Holkar hoped to trigger local rulers to redefect to his banner and collapse the British position that way. Holkar began implementing his strategy as soon as war broke out. In April 1804, he launched a demonstrative raid against Rajputana, showing his flag not just before local rulers, but also the Bengal army itself. Stung, the commander of the Bengal army, General Lake, responded by marching towards Kota, whose ruler submitted in June. At this point, likely assuming that Holkar's forces had been safely contained, Lake then took most of the Bengal army back to monsoon quarters in Hindustan, leaving a 3,000 sepoy column under a subordinate, Colonel Monson, to continue securing the area. For the next month, Monson operated in the hills south of Kota, capturing local forts and trying to locate the British reinforcements that were supposed to be marching out from Gujarat. Unbeknownst to him, that force had been badly delayed thanks to logistics issues, so after much frustration, Monson finally decided to begin withdrawing back to Kota. That was when Holkar's light cavalry suddenly reappeared behind him. What happened next was a British catastrophe reminiscent of Napoleon's retreat from Russia 8 years later. Tailing the British rear, Holkar's light cavalry began doing what they did best, picking off stragglers, plundering baggage, and stoking panic. As morale collapsed and his sepoy column dissolved into a desperate mob, Monson abandoned everything and dashed for Kota, only for the ruler to shut his gates and defect to Holkar. Over the next 2 months, this sequence of events repeated itself over and over again until Monson, almost by himself, finally limped into Agra, having lost all his men, a third of the Bengal army, in the process. Equally importantly, his defeat had left a gaping hole within the British encirclement, which Holkar could now pour through to reach the rich and indefensible plains of Hindustan. As soon as he heard of Monson's disaster, Lake remobilized his Bengal army, but until that process was complete, he could do little. In the meantime, the British were forced to perform strategic triage, abandoning almost everything in Hindustan to reconcentrate within the key cities of Delhi and Agra. Even the occupation of Holkar's capital by the much-delayed Gujarat force did little to stem Maratha momentum now. Finally, in mid-September, Holkar erupted into Hindustan. He now led a horde of 60,000 light cavalry, its ranks swollen by mercenaries, ex-sepoys, and opportunists looking to exploit British weakness for profit. Knowing this, Holkar's goals for this campaign were less about fighting the British, and more about getting local rulers to submit through paying tribute. In the latter, he was quite successful, with his massive force convincing much of Rajputana to redefect to his side. With regards to the former, he was markedly less so, with most of his light cavalry unable or unwilling to fight. In early October, Holkar's horde moved against Delhi, which only had a ragtag British garrison of about 2,000. Nevertheless, over the next week, the Marathas repeatedly failed to take the city, and eventually withdrew in the face of Lake and his finally mobilized Bengal army. Now that he actually had something on the field, Lake could finally start regaining control of the situation. Accordingly, he split the Bengal army into its cavalry and infantry components, and sent them out on separate campaigns. First, Lake personally led the Bengal cavalry on a chase of Holkar, looking for any opportunity to disperse that force. That opportunity finally came in mid-November, when Lake managed to surprise and storm Holkar's camp in a night battle, after which the Maratha cavalry decided to quit while the going was good, and scattered with their loot. Second, Lake tasked the Bengal infantry with mending the damage done in the wake of Monson's defeat, and rebuilding the strategic encirclement of Holkar. One of the key objectives in this regard was the fortress state of Bharatpur, barely 50 kilometers from Agra, and a key link between Hindustan, Rajputana, and Holkar's domain. Formerly a British subsidiary ally, Bharatpur had defected to Holkar during the latter's September invasion, and its recapture would do much to recover both British India's borders and its badly tarnished prestige amongst the indigenous lords. So in November, the Bengal infantry, under the command of Lake's lieutenant, began the invasion of Bharatpur. But right from the start, it was clear that Indian resistance this time would be fiercer than anything before, perhaps because the British were not inclined to offer terms to whom they considered traitors, or perhaps because Bharatpur expected help from nearby Holkar. In any case, in their first clash of arms before the border fort of Deeg, the British came off quite badly, losing almost a tenth of their force, as well as Lake's lieutenant himself. He was succeeded by none other than Colonel Monson, who again tried to retreat, prompting an angry Lake to order him to stay put. The general arrived in mid-December, took Deeg, and proceeded towards Bharatpur itself, which he besieged as 1805 dawned. The siege of Bharatpur was yet another fiasco for the British. 2 assaults in January cost another tenth of Lake's army to little result. In mid-February, after being reinforced by the Bombay army, Lake tried again twice, only to lose a fifth of his force this time, and on top of that, suffer an embarrassing mutiny of his European troops. All in all, the British lost almost 3,000 men in the siege of Bharatpur, and by late February, Lake had to partially admit defeat and pull back for a long-term blockade of the fortress. Wisely, Bharatpur took advantage of this to quit the war while it was still ahead, offering to resubmit and pay an indemnity in return for forgiveness. Lake accepted. Like the disillusion of Holkar's cavalry horde, Bharatpur's rather mercenary behavior was made in the context of Holkar's failure to make further inroads against British India. In January 1805, while the Bengal army was still busy sieging Bharatpur, Holkar raided Hindustan again, hoping to trigger a second wave of defections. But, without any new battlefield victories or city captures to speak of since September, local rulers were no longer as sure of Holkar's eventual victory as they were before, and as such, they largely adopted a wait-and-see attitude instead. This, in turn, meant that Holkar's cavalry had to operate without local support, and so, within a few months, they were again dispersed by the British. Holkar's momentum was fizzling out, but British India still felt the need to make strategic concessions. Most significantly, the recently defeated Maratha Lord Shinde cleverly took advantage of British difficulties to inform them that he was preparing to defect, prompting the British to hurriedly agree to renegotiate their peace treaty with him. This was desperate diplomacy, but it at least prevented Holkar from regaining momentum, especially important considering his domain was now under British occupation, and his existing cavalry was no longer achieving either plunder or defections. It had taken Lake almost 2 years, and his lines were much further back than where he had intended them to be. But his original strategy was finally in place. Slowly but surely, Holkar's army, like Shinde or BHONSLE before him, began to wither from a lack of funds. In October 1805, Holkar made his final bid for victory as he crossed Rajputana and entered northern Hindustan. Fearing another assault on Delhi, Lake followed him closely, but Holkar continued on to the northwest, towards the last hope he had left, the emerging empire of the Sikhs. By December, Holkar was in the Sikh holy city of Amritsar, petitioning its Maharaja for aid. Lake's counter-proposal came in the form of the Bengal army camping right at the Sikh border. Ultimately, with no real reason to risk the safety of their empire to help the Marathas, the Sikhs denied Holkar's petition, and with his last hope gone, Holkar had no choice but to finally admit defeat and ask the British for peace. The war with Holkar was a nasty shock for British India, and it's not hard to imagine that, had more indigenous states, for example the Sikhs or Afghans, taken advantage of Monson's defeat to dogpile on British India, Mornington might have lost all of his recent northern conquests, and perhaps more. It's also interesting to see how, just as they had assumed all along, British Indian forces took far longer to defeat Holkar's traditional cavalry raiders, compared to the sepoy armies of Shinde and BHONSLE. To an extent, this does reflect British unfamiliarity with Indian military methods, and Holkar likely also benefited from not relying on corruptible European mercenaries. But it's probably too much to extrapolate from this that Indian military modernization was pointless. Firstly, as mentioned before, indigenous sepoys were very effective against other indigenous forces, who were a far more prevalent threat than the EIC. Secondly, much of Holkar's success came from his defeat of the rather incompetent Monson, and Maratha momentum quickly fizzled out once General Lake resumed command. And thirdly, compared with the Maratha sepoys who at least bloodied British Indian forces in pitched battle, Holkar's light cavalry, despite their massive numerical superiority, failed to storm any defended city, nor inflict much damage on non-routing British forces. All they could do was harass the enemy and, like an insurgency, hope that the latter would eventually tire of upholding the status quo. Luckily for Holkar, the EIC was rapidly entering such a mood. Eventually, the British managed to stabilize the situation and push back, but all this came too late to help Mornington. In July 1805, a letter arrived from EIC headquarters in London, blaming the Governor-General for Monson's disaster, and on that basis, removing him from office. What's more, the company made sure that his replacement was to be a mercantilist solely focused on making profit, rather than on grand schemes of war and reform. So by the time of the final peace negotiations in December 1805, British India had not only rejected further expansion, it was actively trying to get rid of unprofitable territories and political obligations. It therefore agreed to revoke the subsidiary alliances with Shinde, BHONSLE, and the Rajput states, and at one point even considered abandoning Delhi itself. In the end, despite all the trouble he had caused, Holkar was left with his domain fairly intact, and implied free hand in Rajputana, and the prestige of having repelled the British. But at least the EIC and the Indian subcontinent could finally enjoy some peace, at least for the next few years. The peace with Holkar marked the end of a tumultuous decade in South Asian history. Between 1799 and 1806, a mere 7 years, British India had not only quadrupled in size, but had also seized control of the Mughal and Maratha rulers, formalizing its position as the sole hegemon on the subcontinent. All this came at the expense of the indigenous powers, most notably Hyderabad, Mysore, and the great Maratha lords, who were respectively vassalized, conquered, and neutralized as viable peer competitors. Despite this, by the end of this period, The reformist strategy makers who spearheaded this expansion had all been removed from office, victims of a mercantilist EIC that had reimposed its priorities onto British India. Governor-General Mornington, as mentioned, was fired in mid-1805 over the Monson debacle. His brother, Wellington, had already left India earlier that year, likely to avoid a similar fate. Even General Lake resigned his command shortly after the final peace with Holkar, partly to protest the abandonment of his conquests by the new EIC administration. These men returned home to an indifferent Britain that was wholly focused on Napoleon and his domination of Europe. In fact, the British political elite initially cared more about Wellington and Mornington's improper use of patronage than anything else they did in India. Nevertheless, the achievements of both men were soon recognized, and they would play leading roles in the key British effort of the time, which was the Peninsular War in Iberia. As for British India, while the EIC and mercantilism might have won in 1807, they could not completely turn the clock back, and imperial expansion gradually wormed its way back into colonial strategy. In 1817, Peshwa Baji Rao rebelled unsuccessfully against British control in the Third Anglo-Maratha War, and as a result, the Maratha Empire was abolished, and the Maratha and Rajput states re-vassalized. To secure these gains in turn, British India was compelled to continue expanding into India's borderlands, triggering future wars with the Nepalis, the Afghans, the Sikhs, and beyond. Similarly, the EIC could not stem the growing popularity of reformism within the British political and administrative elite, and future governor-generals would resume Mornington's work to Europeanize Indian society. In time, they would even go beyond the land reorganizations mentioned in Part 3 and begin dabbling in cultural reform, most notably in banning traditional widow sacrifice. The EIC itself would not be spared from attack, as its monopolies would eventually be abolished in favor of free British trade. This unrelenting drive to reform India would come to a screeching halt with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but the aftermath of that war also marked the culmination of the reformist vision, as the Mughal Empire and the feudal hierarchy it represented was fully overthrown in favor of the culturally and ethnically Europeanized state order of the British Raj. In assessing the impact of the British conquest of India from 1798 to 1806, the popular literature tends to focus on Arthur Wellesley and how his experience as a sepoy general shaped his military approach against Napoleonic France. Frankly, given Wellington's rather spotty record on the subcontinent, he likely discounted much of what he had learned there. Instead, for his battles in Europe, the Iron Duke would reject his highly aggressive approach in India, and instead adopt a famously defensive and cautious style that would earn him glory from Portugal to Waterloo. In fact, the most impactful military event of this period was probably the catastrophe of Monson's retreat, which greatly intensified the infamous British neurosis regarding the security of their Indian empire. But they had good reason to fear, as Monson demonstrated that any defeat could be seen as a sign of political change, and therefore turn into a signal for Indian lords to defect en masse. From here on out, every battlefield loss in the subcontinent, especially in the northwest, would send the British into a strategic panic, and to avoid this, they would adopt a forward strategy to push the risk of battle as far away from India as possible, leading to the famous Great Game in Central Asia. Continuing with strategic analysis, despite the huge expansion of British India under his administration, it's not clear that Mornington's efforts were actually a net benefit for Britain, at least in the short term. While, on paper, he did gain more resources, Mornington's government was too overstretched to exploit them properly, and he never managed to increase the EIC's profits. So Mornington's wars didn't actually add to British power. If anything, by risking the possibility of a Monson-esque battlefield defeat, the Governor-General was actively jeopardizing the existing benefits British India was already giving Britain. Of course, in the following decades, Britain would benefit hugely from exploiting India as a resource base and captive market, but it still might have made more sense to delay expansion until then. As for the indigenous powers, their fates are a grim reminder of what often happens to non-aligned states in an era of great power competition. With little political or ideological stake in the broader struggle between Britain and revolutionary France, it was perfectly natural for indigenous Indian rulers to try and avoid committing themselves to either side, especially since being explicitly pro-French like Tipu Sultan guaranteed war with British India, while being a pro-British subsidiary ally meant loss of independence. This likely explains why so many Indian rulers continued to accept French factions within their courts and militaries, despite revolutionary France's inability to do anything for them. In theory, non-alignment gave indigenous states the most strategic freedom, allowing them to set their own agendas and perhaps even access both British and French resources. But if that was the intention, then in reality, non-alignment could only be described as a major strategic mistake. Far from securing their freedom to maneuver, it instead drove indigenous states into war with British India, as Mornington depicted their attempts to balance out British influence as support for revolutionary France. To an extent, this outcome was unforeseeable, as Mornington was an unprecedentedly aggressive leader. But ultimately, he was appointed and supported by Parliament, which indicates that Britain, to some extent, was also no longer willing to tolerate Indian non-alignment. The reason for this attitude can be found in the nature of the broader Anglo-French contest. Locked in an ideologically driven struggle where a compromise peace was deemed impossible, British strategy aimed to completely overpower France, which meant mobilizing and optimizing whatever resources were within its grasp. And as seen in Part 1, and unfortunately for the indigenous states, British Reformists by this time considered India within their grasp as part of Britain's sphere of influence, and as such, they expected Indian states to use their resources in a way that supported British strategy. So in this charged, uncompromising environment, by merely refusing to conform to British desires, non-aligned states effectively and perhaps unknowingly marked themselves out as British enemies. And while the inevitable reckoning could be postponed thanks to indigenous strength and resistance, in the end, only Hyderabad, the power that most aligned itself with Britain, managed to survive this period with its starting position largely intact. Interestingly enough, what Britain was doing in India mirrored what revolutionary Napoleonic France was doing in Europe at the same time, where states from Portugal to Sweden were also being attacked due to their failure to align with French strategy. This is only one of the many parallels that can be drawn between the two regions. Others include the frequent use and abuse of vassal states, the megalomania of both Mornington and Napoleon, and even their ultimate downfalls due to overextension and botched retreats. Crucially, both British India and revolutionary France also saw themselves as vanguards for a developmentally superior political order, which justified the conquest, exploitation, and reorganization of their quote-unquote backward neighbors. In this way, we can argue that both the French Revolutionary Wars and the hegemonic wars of British India, and the ideologies they represented, liberalism and imperialism, were actually manifestations of the same trend, which was the rise of Enlightenment political thought in Europe and its associated tendency to quote-unquote scientifically categorize and rank societies based on material achievement. So given the similarities between the British and French attempts at regional hegemony, why did Britain ultimately succeed in India, while France failed in Europe? A common explanation usually revolves around the lack of South Asian unity, but European states, notably Prussia, hardly coordinated any better during this period. Another explanation focuses on the military weaknesses of the indigenous Indian armies, but European forces were arguably just as disadvantaged before the military innovations of revolutionary France. Nevertheless, despite the annihilation of major forces at Hohenlinden, Ulm, Austerlitz, and Jena, neither Austria nor Prussia fell completely under France's control, and in fact, both countries were even strong enough to resume the struggle within a few years of their defeats. This resilience, which contrasts with the near collapse of every Indian power after one or two defeats, was the result of Europe's intense bureaucratic development throughout the early modern period, which allowed states to mobilize resources at an exceptionally efficient rate. By the 1800s, Austria regularly had hundreds of thousands under arms, while the indigenous Indian powers, despite probably having larger GDPs, struggled to maintain forces in the tens of thousands. The sheer size of Austria's armies meant that, unlike the Indian powers, it was never rendered completely helpless after a single battlefield defeat, and accordingly, France was never able to fully control it and therefore establish complete hegemony over Europe. In their defense, the indigenous Indian powers were already some of the earliest non-European states to try and address this bureaucratic deficiency through centralization reforms. But they simply ran out of time, and in any case, plenty more pitfalls lay ahead before they would fully achieve the resilience needed to secure themselves against European imperialism. One other difference that might have contributed to British success and French failure would be their contrasting approaches to governance. While as mentioned, both Britain and revolutionary France sought to reorder conquered societies, the French appetite for change was far larger than that of the British Reformists. In particular, while Mornington's government limited itself to land and elite reorganization, which was already disruptive enough, the French demanded wholesale redistribution, feudal abolition, and cultural change stretching down to even the very calendar itself. Unsurprisingly, this meant that French rule was constantly plagued by local resistance and rebellion, even in culturally adjacent places like Belgium and Switzerland, which siphoned resources away from the primary hegemonic struggle. By contrast, colonial resistance was fairly manageable during Mornington's time in office, and it's no coincidence that the biggest challenge to British India during the 19th century, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, occurred once the British also began meddling with local culture. Lastly, we should also mention the accidents of history that facilitated the British conquest of India between 1798 and 1806, the string of high-level deaths in the 1790s which ended cooperation amongst the powerful Maratha lords, the various succession crises that let Mornington seize large swathes of territory without a fight, and the fratricidal civil war that prevented Afghan intervention in the subcontinent. But while none of these events could have been accurately predicted or planned for, the dramatic impact they had on indigenous states is also a symptom of the aforementioned bureaucratic deficiency in feudal India during this time. Without a strong bureaucracy to provide continuity in government, the replacement of an experienced ruler with an untested successor was always going to result in a period of extreme state weakness, making it extremely difficult for any feudal state to resist conquest for extended periods of time, especially against a post-feudal enemy that did not have such problems, like British India. All in all, the story of the British conquest of India from 1798 to 1806 can be said to revolve around this theme of state capacity. By the late 18th century, the advantage that the post-feudal European states enjoyed here was so great that a new generation of British reformists, exemplified by Governor-General Mornington, could plausibly push for hegemony over the Indian subcontinent, claiming that it was needed to maintain British power against revolutionary France. And while the campaigns of Generals Harris, Wellington, and Lake did much to make the Reformist vision a reality, they were very much helped by the fragility of the indigenous Indian states, whose feudal governments could neither muster nor sustain the level of resource mobilization needed for a successful resistance. So the end result was British hegemony and forced Europeanization, but in the process, the blueprints for a resilient, post-feudal state were also imparted to Indian society. The modern states of South Asia are direct descendants of this tradition, and so in this sense, the British conquest of feudal India also marks the beginning of their birth. Thanks for watching the video, and please like, subscribe, and hit the bell button. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments section.